Brush Park was once one of the most beautiful neighborhoods in the United States. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, it stood just minutes away from downtown Detroit. Filled with massive mansions, wide streets, and elegant architecture inspired by Europe. People called it the Little Paris of the Midwest, and that was not an exaggeration. Wealthy industrialists, doctors, lawyers, and business owners lived here. These were people who helped build America's industrial power. Their homes were designed by famous architects, built with stone, brick, hardwood, and handcrafted details that were meant to last for centuries. Walking through Brush Park at its peak felt like walking through success itself. Everything about the neighborhood spoke of confidence, wealth, and permanence. Detroit at that time was rising fast. The automobile industry was transforming the city into one of the richest places in the world. Jobs were everywhere. Money flowed freely. The city grew larger and more powerful each year. And Brush Park was right at the center of it all. It made sense that the elite wanted to live close to downtown, near their factories, offices, and social clubs. These mansions were not just homes, they were symbols. They showed who mattered in America's new industrial age. But today, when people see Brush Park, many of those mansions are gone. Others stand abandoned, burned, or broken. Some were demolished completely, leaving empty lots behind. This creates a shocking question. How does a neighborhood built for the richest people in the country collapse so completely? These homes survived economic depressions, world wars, and massive population growth. They were built to endure. Yet somehow, they were left to rot while the city still had money, still had people, and still had power. Most people think they already know the answer. They say the car ruined cities. They say people moved to the suburbs. They say Detroit collapsed, and Brush Park collapsed with it. But this explanation does not fully work. Brush Park began to fall apart before Detroit's major collapse. Many mansions were already abandoned by the 1920s and 1930s, when Detroit was still booming. This fact alone tells us something important. The real story is not simple, and it is not comfortable. At first, the change was quiet. Wealthy families began moving out, not because the neighborhood was failing, but because their lifestyle was changing. New suburbs offered larger plots of land, more privacy, and modern conveniences. But when these families left, the houses did not disappear. They remained, standing tall and solid. The problem was not the buildings. The problem was what happened next. These massive homes were expensive to maintain. They required servants, repairs, heating, and constant care. When single families left, the houses were often divided into apartments or rooming houses. On the surface, this seemed practical. But these homes were never designed for that purpose. Their plumbing, wiring, and structure were strained. Maintenance became difficult and costly. Owners began cutting corners. Slowly, damage accumulated. Still, this alone should not have destroyed Brush Park. Cities adapt, neighborhoods change. If the system had supported preservation, Brush Park could have evolved naturally. But it did not. Instead, a series of decisions, made far away from the people who lived there, began pushing the neighborhood toward failure. These decisions were not accidents. They were choices. Banks started refusing loans. Insurance companies increased costs or withdrew coverage. City services declined. Streets, lighting, and infrastructure were neglected. And as conditions worsened, people blamed the residents instead of the system. The narrative shifted. Brush Park was no longer seen as historic or valuable. It was labeled problematic, blighted, and obsolete. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because Brush Park did not collapse simply because people moved or cars were invented. It collapsed because power decided it was no longer worth saving. And once that decision was made, everything else followed. The fall of Brush Park was not sudden. It was slow, planned, and silent. And by the time people noticed, it was already too late. When people talk about Brush Park's destruction, they usually repeat the same explanations. They say automobiles changed cities. They say people fled to the suburbs. They say Detroit collapsed economically. These ideas sound reasonable, but they hide the truth. They are easy stories that protect powerful systems from blame. To understand what really happened, we must look at what those explanations leave out. The automobile did change cities, but it did not destroy Brush Park. Cars gave people the ability to live farther away, but they did not force abandonment. Many wealthy neighborhoods in other cities adapted and survived. What mattered was not the car itself, but how cities chose to respond to it. Highways were built through certain neighborhoods and not others. Investment followed some people and avoided others. These were choices, not accidents. White flight is often mentioned next. After racial tensions and unrest, many white residents left urban centers. But Brush Park's decline began long before the major racial shifts of the mid-20th century. And blaming race ignores a deeper truth. The real damage came from redlining. Banks and governments marked entire neighborhoods as high risk, not because of buildings or crime, but because of who lived there or who might live there in the future. Once an area was redlined, loans disappeared. Repairs became impossible. Decline became inevitable. Urban renewal made everything worse. Under the promise of modernization, highways were built directly through historic neighborhoods. Entire blocks were demolished. Communities were cut in half. Brush Park lost its physical connection to downtown. Noise, pollution, and isolation replaced walkable streets. What was once central became marginal overnight. At the same time, the economics of preservation worked against Brush Park. Restoring a mansion costs enormous money. But restoring one in a redlined area is financially impossible. You cannot get loans. You cannot insure the property properly. You cannot attract buyers willing to take the risk. Even people who wanted to save these buildings were blocked by the system. Eventually, abandonment became the only option. Once buildings were empty, they became vulnerable. Fires, vandalism, and weather did what decades of neglect had prepared them for. The city labeled these structures unsafe and ordered demolitions. But demolition was not a solution. It was the final step in a long process of abandonment. By the time the wrecking ball arrived, the decision had already been made years earlier. The most painful part of this story is that Brush Park did not fail because it lacked value. It failed because value was taken away from it. The neighborhood was sacrificed for hallways, profit, and convenience. Its destruction was not caused by time. It was caused by priorities. This pattern did not happen only in Detroit. It happened across America. Historic neighborhoods were erased, while newer developments were subsidized. Preservation was seen as a luxury instead of an investment. And the cost of these decisions is still visible today in empty lots, lost history, and broken urban fabric. Brush Park teaches us that cities do not collapse naturally. They are dismantled piece by piece. And when the system turns against a place, even the strongest buildings cannot survive alone. Despite everything, some buildings in Brush Park survived. Their survival was not random. They lasted because of location, ownership, and stubborn refusal to give up. These structures show us what could have been possible if different choices had been made earlier. They also raise difficult questions about what preservation really means. In recent years, Brush Park has seen redevelopment. New apartments, townhouses, and restored mansions now stand where ruins once dominated the landscape. On the surface, this looks like success, but redevelopment comes with consequences. Many of the original residents are gone. Property values have risen. History is being polished, simplified, and sometimes erased. This raises a final question. Is Brush Park being saved, or is it being replaced? Preservation is not just about saving buildings. It is about respecting stories, communities, and memory. When restoration ignores the people who lived through the decline, something important is lost. Brush Park's story is not about nostalgia. It is about power. It is about who gets investment, who gets forgotten, and who decides the future of cities. The neighborhood was not destroyed by progress. It was destroyed by decisions. And its future will depend on whether we learn from those choices or repeat them. When people talk about Brush Park, they often focus on buildings. They talk about mansions, architecture, and ruins. But the real story of Brush Park is not only about stone and brick. It is about people. Families lived here. Children grew up on these streets. Lives were built, then slowly pushed aside. The collapse of Brush Park was not just an architectural loss, it was a human one. As wealthy families moved out, new residents moved in. These were working-class people, migrants, and families looking for affordable housing near jobs. Many of them took pride in living in these large, beautiful homes, even if they were divided into apartments. They tried to maintain them with limited resources, but they were trapped in a system that made failure unavoidable. When roofs leaked or pipes broke, help did not come. Banks would not lend money. The city delayed repairs. Landlords often lacked funds or interest. Slowly, living conditions worsened. Still, people stayed. They stayed because they had no better options. They stayed because this was home. But as services disappeared, daily life became harder. Streetlights stopped working. Trash collection became unreliable. Police and fire response slowed. Each small failure sent a clear message. This neighborhood no longer mattered. Fires became common. Some were accidents caused by old wiring. Others were set intentionally, either for insurance money or out of frustration. Each fire destroyed more than a building. It destroyed memories, stability, and trust. Children watched their neighborhoods burn while adults felt powerless to stop it. Fear replaced pride. At the same time, the media shaped a dangerous narrative. Brush Park was described as dangerous and hopeless. Residents were blamed for conditions they did not create. Poverty was treated as a personal failure instead of a systemic one. This made it easier for the city to justify demolitions and neglect. Once a place is labeled as lost, saving it no longer feels urgent. Demolition came next. One mansion at a time, history disappeared. Sometimes entire blocks were cleared and left empty for years. These empty spaces were not rebuilt. They became symbols of abandonment. The silence after demolition was louder than the noise of construction ever was. For former residents, the loss was deep. They were displaced, scattered across the city, or pushed farther out. Community networks were broken. Neighbors who once depended on each other lost contact. This kind of damage does not appear in economic reports, but it lasts for generations. What makes this story painful is that it did not have to happen this way. With investment, policy support, and respect for residents, Brush Park could have evolved. The buildings could have been adapted. The community could have been protected. Instead, the neighborhood was allowed to fail, then blamed for failing. Brush Park reminds us that cities are not just places, they are relationships. When those relationships are ignored, even the strongest foundations crack. And when a neighborhood dies, it is not history that disappears first. It is people. After decades of decline, something unexpected began to happen in Brush Park. Developers returned, cranes appeared, construction crews replaced abandoned houses and empty lots. For the first time in many years, the neighborhood was no longer being ignored. To some, this looked like a miracle. To others, it felt confusing, even painful. Brush Park was being rebuilt, but the question remained, rebuilt for whom? City leaders described this moment as a success story. They spoke about investment, growth, and renewal. New townhouses, luxury apartments, and restored mansions were promoted as proof that Detroit was coming back. Sidewalks were repaired. Streetlights returned. Property values rose quickly. On paper, everything looked positive. But numbers do not tell the full story. Many of the people who once lived in Brush Park were no longer there to see its rebirth. They had been pushed out years earlier by neglect, rising costs, or forced relocation. When development finally arrived, it did not invite them back. Rents were too high. Property taxes increased. The new Brush Park was designed for a different group of people: young professionals, investors, and newcomers drawn by proximity to downtown. This process is known as gentrification. It often begins with good intentions. Revitalization is needed. Buildings must be saved. But when redevelopment ignores history and displacement, it creates a new kind of loss. The neighborhood becomes clean and safe, but also unfamiliar. The people who carried the place through its hardest years are erased from its future. Developers often restored only a few historic buildings, leaving others demolished forever. New construction filled the gaps, but these modern buildings did not carry the same weight or memory. The story of Brush Park became simplified. Marketing materials focused on beauty and lifestyle, not struggle and survival. The past was turned into a decoration instead of a lesson. Some residents welcomed the change. They were tired of abandonment and wanted better services and safety. Their feelings are valid. No one wants to live in neglect. But progress should not require forgetting. True renewal should honor both the buildings and the people who lived within them. This tension defines modern Brush Park. It is both saved and lost at the same time. Saved from decay, but lost as a living community connected to its past. What stands today is not the same Brush Park that once existed. It is a version shaped by market forces, not memory. This pattern is not unique. Cities across America repeat it again and again. Neighborhoods are ignored until they are almost destroyed. Then, when land becomes valuable again, investment returns, but only after original residents are gone. This cycle creates deep mistrust between communities and institutions. Brush Park shows us that redevelopment without justice is incomplete. Buildings can be restored, but damage to people lasts longer. The question is not whether cities should change. They always will. The question is who gets to stay when they do. Brush Park is not just a story about one neighborhood in Detroit. It is a lesson for cities across the United States. What happened here followed a pattern that has been repeated in many places. When we look closely at Brush Park, we begin to see how cities fail not because they lack resources, but because they make the same mistakes again and again. One of the biggest lessons from Brush Park is that neglect is not neutral. When a city stops investing in a neighborhood, that decision creates decline. Roads fall apart, schools weaken, services disappear. This makes life harder for residents and pushes people to leave. Later, the city points to this decline as proof that the neighborhood was already failing. But failure did not come first. Neglect did. Another lesson is that financial systems shape cities more than buildings do. Redlining, loan refusal, and insurance denial turn strong neighborhoods into fragile ones. When people cannot borrow money to repair homes, decay becomes unavoidable. Preservation becomes impossible without access to credit. Brush Park did not lack people who cared. It lacked a system that allowed care to succeed. Urban planning decisions also played a major role. Highways were built for speed and convenience, not for communities. Neighborhoods like Brush Park were cut off from downtown, jobs, and foot traffic. Once isolated, local businesses suffered. Streets that once connected people became barriers. These planning choices were permanent, and their damage lasted longer than any single economic downturn. Brush Park also teaches us that historic preservation must start early. Waiting until buildings are nearly destroyed makes saving them far more expensive and difficult. Cities often say preservation costs too much, but they ignore the cost of demolition, displacement, and loss of identity. In the long run, neglect is more expensive than care. Another important lesson is about listening. Residents warned that Brush Park was being abandoned. They asked for help, repairs, and fair treatment. Decisions were made by planners, investors, and officials who did not live there. When communities are excluded from decisions, trust breaks. Once trust is gone, rebuilding becomes much harder. Cities also fail to understand that mixed-income neighborhoods are healthy. Brush Park once held wealthy families, workers, and migrants over time. Diversity kept it alive. When cities chase only high-income residents, they erase the balance that makes neighborhoods resilient. Stability comes from inclusion, not uniformity. Finally, Brush Park shows us that cities must take responsibility for past harm. Redevelopment without acknowledgement creates resentment. Healing requires honesty. Cities cannot move forward by pretending destruction never happened. Remembering is not about blame. It is about learning. Brush Park stands today as a warning and an opportunity. Its history asks cities a simple but powerful question. Will we repeat these mistakes or finally choose a different path? Every city tells stories about itself. These stories shape how people see the past, understand the present, and imagine the future. Brush Park's story is often told through pictures of beautiful mansions or dramatic ruins. But behind those images is a deeper question. Who gets to decide which stories are remembered and which ones are forgotten? Power plays a central role in this process. Wealthy institutions, developers, and governments often control the narrative. They choose what is preserved, what is demolished, and what is rebuilt. They also choose how history is explained. In Brush Park, the story is often simplified into a tale of decline and rebirth. This version is easy to understand and easy to sell, but it leaves out the years of neglect, displacement, and pain that made decline inevitable. When buildings disappear, stories disappear with them. Each demolished mansion took with it generations of life, struggle, and hope. When empty lots replaced homes, silence replaced memory. Over time, people forget what was lost and accept the present as natural. This forgetting makes it easier to repeat the same mistakes. Brush Park also shows how history can be rewritten. Redevelopment projects often use the language of preservation, even when most of the original neighborhood is gone. A few restored buildings are used to represent an entire past. The rest is erased. This creates a version of history that is clean and comfortable, but incomplete. Who benefits from this version of history? Usually those who arrive last. New residents enjoy beauty without carrying memory. They are not responsible for what was destroyed, but they also do not feel the loss. Meanwhile, former residents watch from a distance as their old neighborhood becomes something unrecognizable. Their connection is emotional, but they are rarely invited to participate in shaping the future. This imbalance creates tension. Cities celebrate progress while ignoring grief. But grief does not disappear just because buildings are restored. It remains in families, stories, and absence. True healing requires space for this grief. It requires listening, acknowledgement, and inclusion. Brush Park reminds us that cities are not neutral. They reflect values. When profit matters more than people, history becomes a tool instead of a truth. When memory is inconvenient, it is buried. But when memory is honored, cities become stronger, fairer, and more human. The final lesson of Brush Park is simple but powerful. The future of cities is not decided only by architects or investors. It is decided by values. If cities choose speed over care, forgetting over learning, and power over people, then Brush Park will not be the last neighborhood to suffer this fate. The story of Brush Park is not over. It continues in every choice made today. And the question it asks us is not about the past. It is about who we choose to listen to and what kind of cities we want to become. Brush Park today stands at a quiet crossroads. It is no longer the neighborhood it once was, but it is also not completely finished becoming what it will be. Some streets are filled with new life, while others still carry the scars of long neglect. This mix of past and present makes Brush Park a powerful symbol of the choices cities continue to face. The future of Brush Park will not be decided by history alone. It will be shaped by policies, investments, and values. Every decision about housing, preservation, taxes, and public space will determine whether the neighborhood becomes inclusive or exclusive, remembered or rewritten. The buildings that remain can either become bridges to the past or decorations without meaning. One of the biggest challenges ahead is affordability. As Brush Park becomes more desirable, prices rise. Without protection, long-time Detroit residents may once again be pushed out, even if they never lived in Brush Park itself. A city cannot heal if progress benefits only a few. Affordable housing is not charity, it is stability. Another choice involves education and memory. Plaques, museums, and community storytelling can help keep Brush Park's full history alive. But memory must be more than symbols. It must include people. Former residents, historians, and community voices should be part of planning and preservation. When cities listen, trust begins to return. Public space also matters. Parks, sidewalks, and shared areas shape how neighbors interact. Brush Park once thrived because people lived close to one another and shared daily life. Modern design can either isolate residents or bring them together. Community is built through design, not just intention. Brush Park's future also depends on honesty. Cities must admit past mistakes instead of hiding them. Acknowledging harm does not weaken progress, it strengthens it. When cities tell the full story, they give people a reason to believe in change. This neighborhood teaches us that the future is not something that happens by accident. It is built slowly, decision by decision. Brush Park can become an example of fair renewal, or another case of selective memory. The difference lies in courage. In the end, Brush Park asks a simple question of every city. Will you build a future that remembers, or one that forgets? The answer is still being written. Brush Park is more than a place on a map. It is a warning, written in brick and stone. It shows what happens when cities choose convenience over care and profit over people. But it is also a story of hope, because even after decades of neglect, something remains. And what remains still matters. The ruins of Brush Park once shocked the world. They became symbols of Detroit's decline, shared in photographs and documentaries. People looked at those images and felt sadness or curiosity, but often missed the deeper lesson. These buildings did not fall because they were weak. They fell because they were abandoned. Strength alone is never enough when systems fail. Yet survival exists alongside loss. A few mansions still stand, restored or waiting. They remind us that destruction was never inevitable. Different choices could have led to a different outcome. This is where hope lives. Not in pretending the past was perfect, but in recognizing that the future is still open. Brush Park also warns us about forgetting too quickly. When redevelopment moves faster than memory, cities lose wisdom. Each erased neighborhood removes a chapter of experience. And without that experience, mistakes return in new forms. Remembering is not about staying in the past. It is about avoiding its traps. Hope comes from people who refuse to forget. Historians, community members, preservationists, and artists keep Brush Park's story alive. They understand that cities are not machines. They are living systems, shaped by relationships. When people care, places can heal. The lasting meaning of Brush Park is not found only in its architecture. It is found in the questions it asks us. Who benefits from progress? Who pays the price? Who gets to stay and who is asked to leave? These questions matter far beyond Detroit. Every city has its own Brush Park, a neighborhood that was ignored, sacrificed, and later rediscovered. The story repeats unless we interrupt it. Brush Park teaches us that interruption is possible, but it requires honesty, patience, and courage. In the end, Brush Park's story is not finished. It continues wherever cities are being planned today, and its final message is clear. Cities survive not because they grow, but because they remember. As the sun sets over Brush Park, the neighborhood grows quiet. The noise of construction fades, and the streets return to stillness. This silence invites reflection, not just about what Brush Park was, or what it is becoming, but about what it teaches us. Because places like this do not disappear without leaving lessons behind. Brush Park began as a dream of permanence. Its builders believed their homes would last forever. They used strong materials, careful design, and immense labor. And in many ways, they were right. The buildings survived fires, economic crashes, and decades of neglect. What they could not survive were decisions made far away from their doorsteps. Decisions that valued speed over care, efficiency over community, and profit over memory. This is the quiet truth at the heart of Brush Park's story. Cities are not destroyed by time alone. They are shaped, weakened, and sometimes broken by choices. When investment is withdrawn, decline follows. When voices are ignored, trust disappears. And when history becomes inconvenient, it is often erased. Yet Brush Park also reminds us that destruction is never the end of the story. Even after abandonment, something remained. Walls stood, streets remembered, and people continued to care. That care, often invisible and unrewarded, kept the idea of Brush Park alive long enough for change to return. But change by itself is not enough. Renewal without remembrance creates beautiful places with empty meaning. Restoration without justice heals buildings but not communities. If cities want a future that is truly strong, they must learn to hold memory and progress together. The final question Brush Park leaves us with is simple but uncomfortable. When we rebuild, who are we rebuilding for? When we tell stories, whose voices are missing? And when we celebrate progress, what are we choosing not to see? These questions matter because they are not about Detroit alone. They appear wherever cities grow, modernize, and compete. Every street under construction, every historic building under threat, carries the same choice Brush Park once faced. Brush Park stands as both a mirror and a warning. It reflects our values back to us. If we see only beauty, we miss the cost. If we see only failure, we miss the responsibility. But if we see the full story, rise, neglect, loss, survival, and return, then Brush Park becomes more than a neighborhood. It becomes a lesson. In the end, cities are remembered not by how fast they grow, but by what they choose to protect. Brush Park's legacy is not written only in architecture, but in memory. And memory, if we allow it, can guide us toward better choices. The story ends here, but the responsibility does not.